This is Killing for Company. My name is Kellen, and today we got an episode or one of a series that's going to be launching your way here. So I wanted to do something a bit more ambitious in scope, I guess a larger project or theme, and this particular series I'm going to do here is on a decade of death metal from the year 2000 to 2010. I remember back a few months I watched an episode that Simon over at Explosive Action did. I will put a link here in the channel, or description I should say, talking about 2000s death metal, and kind of had a slant, like 4 records that was detailing around mid 2000s to around 2010, and kind of caught my attention because in the current wave of what is being called old school death metal, I kind of feel I have an interesting, and people from my generation have an interesting sort of glimpse, because I would absolutely agree that like the 1986 to 96, 95, that era of death metal, and I'm being generous there, I think most people would agree it's like 87 to 93. That era of death metal is incredibly special, untouchable. It's the golden era of the genre, so to speak. But I was too young to really be present for it. So my entrance into the genre comes much later. You know, in the year 2000, I was 16 years old, and by 2010, 26. So that was a key period in my life of listening to music, and it's really when, in those years, that I established a connection with the genre of death metal, and that sort of influences, you know, my taste and where essentially I have an emotional connection to. And I feel that era, that decade, is almost seen as, you know, not a peak era, right? And for a lot of reasons, I understand that. You know, Simon even makes a point in his video talking about, you know, where Nile and Dying Fetus, where everything that had sort of been established in the 90s becomes amplified to the point of potentially losing a lot of like emotional connection. And there'll be other things that we get into later on in this video where like a larger sense of subgenre sort of style, I think, begins to splinter and fragment. And you also have, you know, like something like album art, I think, changes dramatically. And there's a lot of reasons where I think that decade from 2000 to 2010 is dismissed or seen as less important, or sort of a lull within the genre. But it's, you know, where I essentially jumped in and developed a kind of an affection towards that sound to those who potentially didn't share that sort of generational entrance. So I just wanted to spend, you know, a good amount of time investigating and talking about the music in that time period, and I'll be doing, you know, a much larger and longer investigation into that decade than Simon did, but kind of wanted to pick up where he started and just spend some time working on that. So this is going to be part 1, and we're going to start at the beginning of the decade, and this is Skeptic with Pathetic Being. That's what we're listening here in the background. So Skeptic is out of Poland. So when you think Polish death metal at, you know, year 2000, you're not just talking about like bands that have done some pioneering work in the 90s like Vader, but like Decapitated, comes to mind, and this is a kind of technical death metal, which is, I think, also a tag or term that I think that decade of death metal, the 2000-2010, sort of is synonymous with, is incredibly technical bands that sort of emerged and I don't know, sort of made death metal athletic in a way that sort of did not have an emotional pull. But Skeptic, here in 2000, we haven't really reached that point of like technicality to the point of oblivion, right? This is their second full length, I believe, and all the traditional bands that you would potentially think of, like Atheist, for example. But what makes this interesting when you compare it to a band like Decapitated, for example, is it's not nearly as brutal or aggressive. To me, it's probably the best part about it is it stands out for its lead guitar work. It's got like a neoclassical element to it, so even though it's got like some progressive and technical elements going on, the lead guitar work especially stands out because it's blocked or composed in such a way that you can tell that the people who are listening to far more classical influences. You get all those arpeggios and sort of scale work. It's not like a wild, off-the-rails kind of soloing technique. It's much more deliberate in its composition. But a great technical death metal record from, essentially the turn of the millennium. Technical death metal at an interesting period because I don't think it's still holding on to so much of the like trappings of the 90s, even in terms of production technique. So the sound quality here is going to be far more appealing for those who like old school death metal per se, but wanted something a bit more technical and probably haven't heard of Skeptic. This is sort of a second tier technical death metal band that it's worth your time to check out. So that's Skeptic, Pathetic Being, 2000. This is on Crash Music Incorporated. Another thing about this series is it's definitely going to highlight like how much CDs. This is before like vinyl was a thing, so all these are, for the most part, at the early part of the 2000s are going to be CDs, and as we get closer to the end of this decade, you'll see more vinyl into the picture. But another CD here for you. This is Abhorrent, and no, not the Finnish Abhorrent. This is Brazilian Abhorrent. And this is very much in that, Christian rebellion, death metal where you have to put some sunscreen on because the heat coming off of it's gonna give you all sorts of burns. It's just, super fast. And it was interesting to think about, like, Abhorrent, for example, or other bands from Brazil that ilk. Like, it was almost considered just the intensity of it and the pacing was almost considered brutal. I think now people are more comfortable with that sort of genre definition based on what was happening in New York and different song dynamics. But just, this band and other bands from Brazil at the time were like taking like the intensity of like deicide, right? So there's that satanic theme as well, and just they never take their foot off the pedal, or rarely. Very dry in terms of its production quality, which almost gives it this like black metal sense of high-end distortion. It wouldn't, when I think of like Christian's transition to Conquerors of Armageddon, Century Media kind of gives them a bit more weight and heft, and again, Record has a little bit more of a polish and depth to it that a larger label release would get. Where Abhorrent here, this is Evoking the Abomination, by the way, is the name of this. This is a listenable record release. I think that is probably a reissue. I'm not sure, but I guess for people who are trying to collect death metal from Brazil, you get like that death thrash that's coming from Sepultura and that thrash scene, but the death metal really picks up for me from the mid-90s into the 2000s. And Abhorrent is one of those bands, I don't know if it's because of the name, how common the name is, but they just, I think, got skipped over. This is their only full-length. So if you love that style of just really fast, satanic, violent, scorching death metal, Evoking the Abomination is a good little like hidden gem to add, which is to a really sort of defining era within Brazilian death metal. That's Abhorrent, Evoking the Abomination. Okay, moving on. All right, which one do I want to go for next? Okay, here we go. Okay, Eternal Grey. So, right, we were talking about, like, I mentioned artwork earlier on, like, that is absolutely a 2000s, maybe end of the 90s, you see something like that, but that is definitely a 2000s album artwork. So this is a band, right, I believe from Israel, and they play an interesting blend of, think like, okay, you have a little bit of Swedish death metal, so like let's say Unleashed, but it's got progressive elements that would almost remind you of something like Nevermore, right, where it's yes progressive, but it's also profoundly melodic, and has all these mid-pace sort of grooves that are easy to digest and jump into. But a lot of fun to listen to, and it's also in the 2000s. I guess there was still, bands who were trying to make it like at this point in time. You think of someone like Cannibal Corpse, right? Like they are so firmly entrenched in not just the death metal scene, but like a bigger name within metal in general across the board, right? And I wonder if, to some part of me, like, I was at this point just a teenager, but like if you were thinking about the grander scope of it, with a band like Eternal Grey, like they must some part of them, as much as they wanted to play this kind of death metal, I wonder if they also thought like this would be potential roads for a longer career, like something that is, I don't want to say it's mellow death. That goes too far.
Never came back. Took my way down.
bit more of ease of entrance. Like there are a few barriers to get into a band like Eternal Grey. They didn't last long at all. This is a very early The End Records release. I don't know, how many of these are out there, but now when I listen to death metal, I don't have the same sort of like predilection towards looking for more aggressive things as much as I am properly trying to like educate myself on the historical context in which they emerge. And Eternal Grey is just like an interesting sweet spot in like the early 2000s. I think this is 2002. But if you like, it's got like the aggression of a Swedish death metal band to some extent, but it's got that like nevermore progressive groove element in it as well. It's a fun balance. It sort of moves in these like blocked pieces where there's like intros and outros. The closing 3 tracks, intro, World of Ice, and the outro to the album, that's worth your time. If you just want like a 10-minute glimpse into what this album is, go check that out. Eternal Grey, I forgot to mention the name, Kindless. That guy's not having a good day. He's definitely living in a kindless world. Eternal Grey, moving on. Okay, so next up, I think we'll go with this. Speaking of brutal death metal, this is Houwitser. I believe this band is Dutch. And this is, by all means, a brutal death metal record, but also one that is sort of dated by its era. It has far more to do with, sinister than it does like devourment. So, like, there's no real slam dynamics going on here. And in 2003. Get this right. I want to say 2003. Refer to my cheat sheet here. Okay, 2002. Another 2002 record here. In 2002, Rage Inside the Womb is our title. You can hear by the production, it's definitely influenced by what was going on in the Northeast, right? But you also have like severe torture that's happening in the Netherlands. It's sort of pioneering some space for a greater degree of brutality in the Netherlands. And it's got all like your classic, like super gruesome movie samples, or like, someone's like at a trial describing like the murder scene or something like that. It's got all those samples here for you, so very much in terms of that like mid to late 90s brutal death metal comes from the States. It's right in par with that, like Dehumanized or Eternal Suffering, but it's also still like that sinister side, right, where it hasn't got to the point where you don't have like memorable riffs or like fun sort of mid-paced riffs that are going on. So in that sense, like it's far more enjoyable to me, and it kind of brings back like, if ever I get tired of a lot of the modern brutal death metal scene, like it gives me personally a good sort of like guidepost as to what I should be looking for, or a standard to, there's probably bands who are in this vein that are making music now. I just maybe have to look a little bit harder for them, given the time period that separates, this record from a lot of the modern bands that are happening in 2021. But Houwitser is awesome, and it's another sort of like second tier brutal death metal band from the Netherlands that you maybe not heard, that has been buried. This is an Osmos release, Osmos Productions. If you want, if you're a little death metal, if you like that genre and you're looking for something, you know, from decades past, sort of expanding into the European scene, this is a great one to add to your collection. Houwitser, Rage Inside the Womb. Okay. Next up. Okay. This one's got a little bit of a story to it. So, you know, that 2000 era, you also have like all your digital downloads and so on and so forth. I don't know how I got wind of this, but I got a hold of some, you know, just MP3 files. And this is Perfy Biblical. They're an Italian band. And when I thought about making this video, I was, you know, searching to see if I could get a physical copy of this. I found someone on Discogs who was selling it. And this was back in 2003. Released, it was a, you know, independent release from the band. So I actually don't know if this is like a former band member who's just making like CDR copies and sending them out through Discogs, but it was sent to me from Italy. But this, you can clearly see that is like, you know, some homemade, they went and just printed off some, you know, hardstock paper. This is entitled Born. And what's, you know, unfortunate is I would pay a solid chunk of change for this in a like LP, you know, vinyl pressing, because this is amazing. Like if there's one record that or CD that I'll talk about here today that you haven't heard that you should definitely check out. I mean, I don't think this is even on YouTube. Maybe like one or two songs is. I remember when I was trying to research it, I was looking around, but this sounds like incantation, immolation with like Nile. So it's super heavy and it's got tons of atmosphere. So the incantation side, I think people will sort of have that immolation, like dark, sinister death metal from the Northeast. People will immediately sort of identify. But if you stick around, it's that like in the backdrop kind of atmospherics, or if you ever get to an instrumental track, right, that has none of the like Egyptian themes or tropes or anything, but just that like second, you know, wave of atmospherics that a band like, even if it's just like the guitar tracking that this band operates with is exceptional. It makes for such a fun listen, and for people who are now like getting into that sound, but it moves at a much slower pace than a lot of the bands that had moved in the 2000s. So if you were thinking about like Drawn and Quartered or Father Befouled, excuse me, I can get my coffee here. Like this is to me a little bit slower, a bit more mid-paced, but just the atmosphere is so much fun to listen to. And I think, you know, for modern, you know, death metal fans who maybe like, you know, as much for a record like the Disma gets, this is, you know, almost a decade prior, and I think deserves more attention. Is a better record, just has no distribution. So I think you can find this. I'm sure it's the exact guy selling the CDR printed version of this. It's not fun in terms of the, like, I'll post in the video here the actual artwork that is like on Metal Archives. that I don't know if it was ever distributed or they were licensed to provide that same artwork for this CD when it was self-released. But I think you can get this, and the sound quality is great. I cannot recommend this record. Perfidy, probably that word, do not know. But perfidy biblical. Born, check it out. To whatever I can find for you, but if there's one record you should really check out, it's this one, just because it is such a weird, odd release that got hidden in history, and it was absolutely worth your time. Okay, last one here for you. This is Verminus. So this is a 2003 release. This is on Extreme. Check that out there. Impious Sacrilege is the name of this record. So this is a Swedish death metal band that is not like trying to go for that Swedish death metal tone, which to me, is kind of refreshing. To be perfectly honest, it's probably more common. When I listen to this, the first thing I think is how much I need to be versed in the Swedish hardcore punk scene to navigate the intricacies of this band, because it's very punk. In the same way you can kind of listen to the riffing style of Autopsy, and see how it has a degree of punk influence. You listen to Abscess, so it's a crust punk element there, right? But this is it's just very straightforward, neck-breaking death metal, but doesn't have all these sort of added weight in terms of the guitar tone that you get. So to a certain degree, you get from a Swedish death metal record, so it feels stripped down by comparison. But there's even an Autopsy, Charred Remains, there's an Autopsy cover here. And it's not Autopsy like you would think, right? It's much more straightforward and well executed, clean cut, just bare bones, ripping death metal. It's not doesn't have a big thrash influence. It's just square in the center of death metal, but there's no extra sort of embellishment to this. It just, in that sense, it offers a certain degree of a punk ethic or identity. But this is Extreme Music, 2003, and they're doing satanic death metal, but it's just not like Deicide or not like other bands of that era, like Vital Remains or something like that. No prisoners, kind of to the point death metal, and to me, they only put out 2 full lengths, and there's a decade that separates them. But it's refreshing to hear a band who just like understands, you know, especially coming out of Sweden, like we don't have to do the Entombed Dismember thing. Like we can just play some straightforward killer death metal and people will love it. Verminus, check it out. Impious, Sacrilege. So that's my group of CDs here for this first episode. I think I've got the evening to myself here, so I may record another after I take a quick break and gather everything. But check it out. 2000s death metal. I'll put a link to the Simon Explosive Action episode for you. But until then, I'll see you guys later. Bye.